Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to do a quick overview of Genesis. I've got maybe 15 minutes to run this through. We'll do an overview, kind of setting the table for the rest of the Bible, actually, is what Genesis will do for you. There's a right out of the gate assumption that God exists. God establishes that He exists before creation. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created, is the key phrase for all of the Bible. If you can get past the idea that God created everything, if you can accept that by faith, now the rest of the Bible naturally falls into place, and it isn't as difficult when you come across miracles or you come across the words of Jesus later on in the New Testament to wrestle with those things, because God is outside of time, space, and matter. He actually created it. So He's able to override the laws he put in place in this natural world, because He's supernatural. He's outside of, before, and after creation. So that's kind of the intro of Genesis, is that very first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Beyond that, in Genesis, you'll see it's the book of beginnings. So you have a lot of first mentions of words like sin, love, grace, even righteousness, and then we're going to have different themes that come through that begin in Genesis and are kind of bow tied at the end in Revelation. So you have the introduction of sin, the introduction of humanity as created beings, the problem of sin in humanity throughout history. The solution is hinted at in Genesis chapter 3. The woman and her seed will actually crush the head of the serpent, although the serpent will bruise the heel of the seed of the woman, which is pointing prophetically to Christ. The fall is a turning point. So you have the first two chapters are God's creation, everything after its own kind, in order, it's good. And God rests on the seventh day. Man was created on the sixth day, and God said it's good. He gave Adam responsibility to tend in the garden. And as he's tending the garden, he's occupied and he has purpose. And the fall is in chapter 3, and tragically, that good design, that good purpose is disrupted and actually foiled by Satan, by the serpent. So in the following books of the Bible, you're going to have God creating and bringing the solution. And in the process of Genesis, though, we see there's sort of this broad humanity leading up to the flood. It says everyone is doing only what is evil continually. That's what's in the heart of man, is to continually do evil and not think of anything else. Now, God put it in us to long after Him, but given no parameters, given no guardrails, but our own conscience will derail, just like they did in the early part of Genesis prior to the flood. So you can see that in chapter 6. So Noah is called to make an ark. Now the ark is an enormous ship that's to house all species, all kinds of animals. So the timeline from the fall to Noah could be 1,000 years. We're not really quite sure, but it's generations. And then Noah comes on the scene, and now Noah is told to build this great ark because rain's going to come down. Now, there hadn't been any concept of rain at the time, because the earth was covered with a water canopy, we're told in Genesis. There wasn't any rain cycle. There wasn't a hydrologic cycle of rain, then flowing rivers, and then evaporation, and then clouds form, and then rain again. There was just a basic water canopy. Tropical vegetation probably surrounded the whole earth, and the climate was fairly temperate to tropical. But what we see in Genesis there in chapters 6 and 7 is all of a sudden the earth, topography, geography all dramatically changes, and it's a worldwide flood. God is judging the whole earth because their thoughts are only continually evil. So God has not he's not arrived at a good situation, and he's ready to deal with mankind. But it says there that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So Noah is the one who found grace in the eyes of the Lord, not only because God was seeking out one, but Noah was actually seeking out God. So Noah had his heart turned. Among all of those people, Noah was the one who was seeking God's heart. And God found, and God saw that, and Noah found grace in his eyes. So God gave Noah instructions to build this enormous boat and prepare for a great flood. And no one had known what a flood was or rain up until that time. So you'll see in chapter 7 and in chapter 8 the results of the flood, the timeline of the flood, the purposes God had with the flood. And in the end, there's only 8 couples left after the flood of all the earth, all the population of the earth. 8 couples: Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives. And shortly after the waters recede, they debark from the plane, you might call it. They go off of the ark. Deboard, maybe is the word. And it says that each of the sons go a different direction, one to Asia, one to Africa, one to Europe. And in that you have the 3 major continents of the ancient world, and Israel is at the heart of it there in the Mediterranean. But the ark landed on the mountains of Ararat in modern-day Turkey. And it's off limits now, but there have been some discoveries that they've found what may represent the actual ark itself, timbers and stuff frozen in the mountains high up in the above the ridge line, above the tree line and all that, where there wouldn't be wood. It's high enough up that it seems like it's out of place. There were some expeditions in the early 1900s that they did find it. Apparently they found it and located it, but Turkey's made it off limits. So after the flood, you have the earth being repopulated in 3 different areas, and that's the majority of the population growth as it began. And that doesn't preclude land bridges and those types of things that eventually happen, that people migrate to North America, South America, so that there are populations there as well. And now in the interval between the flood and kind of what we know as Abraham in chapter 12, when Abraham is introduced, that interval is probably when the book of Job was written. So these patriarchal men who had great expanse of land and people and property, and all of that was under them. These would have been those men who lived a long time just after the flood, because the lifespan went from 600 to 700 years down to, by the time of Moses, which is 1,000, 2,000 years later, to roughly 120 years or 80 years even. And you see that pretty quickly in the life of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So their lifespan reduces dramatically over the generations after the flood. But those initial first generations would have been the patriarchs who had a long lifespan, and they would have been amassing wealth through their family line around them. So you fast forward to chapter 10, chapter 11, that's where the Tower of Babel is. And that's post-flood, men gathering. Now God told them to go ahead and repopulate, multiply, and repopulate the whole earth. But in chapter 10, the Tower of Babel gives us a hint that they weren't traveling wide and far. They were congregating in cities again. And that's not what God wanted. So, and in this, chapter 10, there's a tendency to see it as God being cruel. But what's happening is there's an idolatrous move against God, and led by a man named Nimrod. He was a mighty hunter against the Lord, is the term. And he was actually harvesting the souls of men. And he was an evil man, and he was the one who designed and strategized to build the Tower of Babel. Now, the Tower of Babel was a giant ziggurat. It was a giant, almost a pyramid, but it kind of had a spiraling way that they could build it so they could continue to go higher and higher. So they started with a really wide base and built it up. And in the process of it, they wanted to build a tower to the heavens. Now, this is opposing God and the plan of God, because first he said to go ahead and scatter and be multiplied across the earth. They're gathering together in one place, and now they're building a tower to reach the heavens or the stars, you might say, because they were worshiping the stars. They were worshiping false gods. And this is the seat or the original root of what we know as ancient Babylonia and the ancient Babylonian kind of religious system that worshipped the moon, the sun, and the stars. And multiple cultures around the world throughout history have then also mimicked this same model of worship. And it is opposed to the one true God that's revealed in the Bible. So when you get a little bit past that, God scatters the people by confusing their languages, so they can no longer communicate. And now you have groups breaking off according to their communication ability. They can talk to each other, they understand each other. Now you have different groups breaking off. And that, by its very nature, begins to separate men and forces them out further. And that's where we get cultures and languages and people groups. And it's all kind of very simply explained in chapter 10 as you kind of think it out methodically. Oh, well, that makes sense. So that people group would continue to have families and children and neighborhoods, and they would kind of stay to themselves for generations. And that's where you get almost a proper separated gene pool, you might even say. So that's where we get, and that's how we see races and nation and people groups and languages all coming from Genesis chapter 10 with the confusion of languages. And then shortly after that, we're introduced to Abram in chapter 12, and he is what we call the father of faith. He is exhibiting the first, well, Noah was great. Adam and Eve struggled in the garden, but Noah represented finding grace in God's eyes. But Abraham, we have a great example of actually believing and it being accounted to him for righteousness, which is what God wants us to catch. He wants us to take him at his word and believe, and it'll be accounted to us for righteousness. So Abram is introduced as an older man. He's been told by God to leave his home, to go to a place I will show you. And God leads him to the land of Canaan. He was living in that same region of ancient ancient Babylonia, or of the Chaldees. That is kind of the location of the Tower of Babel, you might say. In that general region, he's told to leave that. God is going to lead him away. He's going to tell him where to plant, where to settle. And at an old age, he takes his whole family, all of the people with him, and he heads out waiting for God to lead him, telling him where he should plant, but he doesn't know where he's going. Now, that might be difficult for some of us to do, but that's what Abraham did, and it was an example of his faith. And that's what God is asking of us. Sometimes he asks us to do this, to leave everything we know without any clear direction, and he's going to lead us to a place he'll show us. And that's what happened with Abraham. And then Abraham was given a promise. God met with Abraham and Sarah, and he promised that he would give them a son of promise. And through this son, the whole world would be blessed. And this is Genesis chapter 12, Genesis 13, it's repeated, and then Genesis 22, it's also repeated. And then when Isaac comes on the scene, he's the son of promise. Abraham has a little hitch in there where he tries to help God out. That's where Ishmael comes from, which is Ishmael would be the father of a lot of the Arab nations. So in Abraham's haste, he created problems for his own people down the line. But God blessed Abraham and Ishmael even in that mistake. And then Isaac is now the son of promise. Isaac grows up, and he has a son. His son is named Jacob. Each of these guys, as you study them, they have brilliant and great lessons for walking by faith and not by our own sight, not by our own understanding, because they weren't presented as perfect. They were presented as very flawed, yet men who have their eyes on God and seeking God, even in their own struggles. They've asked the Lord to help them, and God responds to them. So Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob is the son of Isaac. So Jacob was a twin. His older brother was Esau. And the Jacob-Esau kind of narrative goes on in the middle chapters of the chapter 23 to 27-ish, something like that. Now, Esau was favored by Isaac. Jacob was favored by his mother, Rebecca. And Rebecca wanted Jacob to have all of the privileges, but because he wasn't the oldest, Esau had the rights of the privileges. So this is where you see some of the conniving that comes out of Jacob's life. Jacob set a course of being a trickster, and he played a lot of tricks on people, and especially his brother. He tricked his father out of the blessing. The blessing traditionally was from the father to the oldest son. The blessing of prosperity and all those kind of things as they grow and as they continue to carry the family name through the oldest son. But Jacob tricked Isaac to get the blessing. And shortly after, prior to that, he tricked Esau for the birthright as well. And the birthright was kind of the proper lineage authority, and Esau traded it for a bowl of soup because he was a man after the flesh. He would rather have something to feed his flesh than something that was significant for the future of his family's well-being. And this is a lesson. So Jacob isn't right to steal it or to deceive for it, but Esau is also an example of a very worldly, fleshly man. He would be the type of someone who seeks after things for immediacy and for my fleshly appetites at the expense of God's bigger plan in my life. So be warned about Esau. Now Jacob, we see Jacob fleeing after he tricks Isaac for the blessing. He flees and leaves home, never to see his mom again, and he heads back to where the family was a long time ago, and he kind of begins this whole saga with his uncle Laban. So his father's, his grandfather's brother type of a thing, or nephew. It's a family relation where Abraham came from is where Jacob flees to. And they're still extended family. And Laban is there as the father of the woman that captures Jacob's heart. And you'll read that, and that story is really interesting. But there's a lesson there that the Bible talks about. What you reap, you will sow. It says in Galatians, what you reap, you're going to sow. So Jacob, in reaping deception, also has sown deception through his life. When he meets Laban, he's going to reap the same from this family relative. So it ends up being a 21-year period, I think, where Jacob is gone. But while he's there, he gains 2 wives, multiple maidservants, and a lot of livestock and wealth. So God's hand is on Jacob because the blessing from Abraham extended and was repeated to Isaac. And shortly we'll see with Jacob, there's another repeating of that blessing for Jacob. So through Jacob's family then is where God has he's taken kind of this wide lens of the whole world and the population of the whole world during the flood. And then he zeroes into the family line of Abraham. And then he tightens it up a little bit to Isaac. And now he tightens it finally to Jacob's family. And the group of Jacob's family, as you read there in the middle portion of the chapter 30s, you might call it, Jacob's family is introduced as the 12 tribes of Israel. This becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. He has 12 boys, and he has 1 girl, Dinah, as the daughter. But he has 12 boys, and these 12 boys are all born by 4 different mothers. So it's kind of this random mix, a lot of what we call in our day and age, a lot of dysfunction in the family. It's a very dysfunctional family. A lot of rivalries, a lot of what you might even call Jacob's pattern of deception, a lot of mistakes. They aren't presented as perfect men by any stretch, which is interesting when you get to the New Testament. The Pharisees, in John even, the Pharisees appeal to their fathers. And Jesus corrects them. He's like, hey, don't appeal to your fathers. They weren't something to be appealed to. Yes, there's value to them, but don't appeal to them for your righteousness. And that's certainly the case. We can never appeal to those who came before us for our own righteousness. We only appeal to Christ for our righteousness. So in this, the family of Jacob is presented. And the boys all grow up. There's all kinds of rivalries. There's all kinds of infighting. There's all kinds of weirdness that actually happens. And then we're introduced to Joseph. Joseph is the last key character in the book of Genesis. And Joseph is important because he becomes a very clear type of Christ. And he's sold into slavery because of jealousy. Jacob favored him with a coat of many colors, but the other brothers hated him for it. And Joseph was kind of foolish as a young boy. He spoke out a little bit too soon and sort of stirred the pot even. But in that, he's captured by his brothers. He's thrown in a pit. It says in the Psalms that he cried out in anguish of soul, like he was terrified in this pit, a deep well, you might call it. You might think about that. A deep, dry well. He's down in the bottom of this well, and they're up there sitting around the fire deciding what they're going to do with Joseph. So Joseph is crying out, and then all of a sudden one of them sees a traveling caravan of Ishmaelites. So these Ishmaelites, interesting, goes back to what would even be family relation in some respect. The Ishmaelites then buy Joseph for 20 pieces of silver, and they haul him all the way to Egypt. So Joseph is now in a foreign land, and he's sold into the house of an administrative leader within the Egyptian government. But it says, multiple times it says, but God was with Joseph. And Joseph is a lesson for us, even in difficult times, but God was with Joseph. Don't lose heart when things become difficult or things actually become completely out of your control and unfair. As you're walking and trusting in God, he's with you. So Joseph is in Potiphar's house, and it says in Potiphar's wife longed to be with Joseph. He was a handsome young man, and she was used to getting what she wanted, and Joseph was careful not to be around her until one time she caught him in the house alone, and Joseph fled, but she had grabbed his coat or his shirt or his tunic, you might call it, and he fled out of the house, just completely running away from the temptation. And what she did, because she was so angry, she accused him of raping her. She accused him of attacking her, and he got thrown in jail. And Potiphar couldn't do anything about it because it would look bad if he probably knew that it was her, not Joseph. So anyhow, Joseph now, for the third time, bad things happen. It seems to get only worse. He goes to prison. He's in prison, kind of rotting away, forgotten in prison. And one day, the baker and the cupbearer from Pharaoh's court are also in the jail cell with Joseph. So Joseph talks to them for a bit. And eventually, it's interesting because Joseph was in charge of all of Potiphar's house and all of his bookkeeping, all of his administrative stuff after a couple of years. And while he's in jail, the same thing happens again. He's actually running the jail. He's administratively operating the jail. And this is kind of like God's hand is with Joseph, but God is with Joseph. So Joseph now rises to the top within the jail system there in Egypt. And these two men are landed in the quarter that he's in. He talks to one of them after he had a bad dream. One of the guys had a bad dream, and Joseph gives them the clear interpretation. And Joseph says, but when you go back to Pharaoh, remember me before him, because Joseph wanted to be let off the hook. So as Joseph described the dream, it came to pass exactly as Joseph described it. One of them was killed and the other was reinstated. And there was kind of this roundabout way through the dream that Joseph interpreted that happened. So the one that was alive was still by Pharaoh's side, and later on, Pharaoh has a dream that disturbs him greatly too. And this is when the guy actually remembers Joseph. He's like, oh, I remember I was in jail. When I was in jail, there was a guy who interpreted my dream. So Pharaoh brought Joseph that day before him, and he asked Joseph to interpret this dream. So this dream was about 7 years of of great harvest, and then followed by 7 years of famine. So in that, the process of Joseph describing the dream, Pharaoh was convinced that Joseph was gifted of God. And he said, so what do you think the solution is? Joseph said, well, you need to assign somebody to administer everything and make sure in the good years you're saving for the bad years to provide for the people. And Pharaoh said, good, then you're the guy. And so Joseph went in one day from the prison cell to the palace, second in command only to Pharaoh. Now the 7 good years go by, and then the next 7 years begin of famine, and Joseph has done his job, and people begin coming from nations all around to purchase grain because of the storehouses of Egypt. And one of the groups that came from his own family. So Jacob, in desperation, sent his boys to go get grain in Egypt. Now it's been at least 12 to 14 years since they sold Joseph into slavery. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes the boys immediately, his older brothers, when they come. So think about Joseph is close to 30 by now, and his older brothers are close to 50 each, 50, 40, 45. They're all older than him, except his youngest brother, Benjamin. So Benjamin didn't make the trip, but all the rest did. And this is an interesting story. It's really fun to get into and read. But the first time they see Joseph, they don't recognize him. And he has them arrested, and he makes them sweat it out. And then he says, okay, one of you has to stay. The rest of you go and get the younger brother, because he quizzes them. Is this all of you? Are you spies? I don't think this is all of you. They said, well, we do have a brother. And he says, all right, this one's arrested. So he arrested Judah. This one's arrested until you bring back the other one, because he wanted to see his little brother. And he and his little brother had the same mom. All the rest had different moms. So there was a closeness between them that way. So then they went away. They told Jacob. Jacob is fearful because now he's lost Joseph, and now he's going to lose Benjamin. And the boys are all talking to themselves about it, like, well, it's been over our heads ever since we told Dad that Joseph was killed. They had shown him the coat, and they'd smeared ram's blood all over it and made it look like he was eaten by a cougar. And Jacob had been grieving for this entire time the loss of Joseph. And the boys are constantly thinking about, like, what? Maybe it's the guilt. The guilt's hovering over them. So then they come back with Benjamin, and through sort of some, you might call it stage setting by Joseph, he coaxes out of them a confession. And then he reveals himself to them as the brother that they thought they had lost. And then he says, go and get Dad. And so this whole process of not being recognized the first time, but the second time being revealed and being embraced it's a snapshot, we're told, by Stephen in Acts 7, of the coming of Christ. The first time they rejected him, but they will receive him. And this is the pattern that's going to happen when Jesus returns. He was rejected the first time and hung on a cross. The second time he'll come in glory and victory, and he'll be received gladly. So that's the story of Joseph, and it ends as they're leaving Egypt, and they're traveling back to the land of promise. They're traveling back. Joseph is actually thinking there's a day coming when you're going to travel back. So when you go, so they just settled there because Joseph basically gave them the plush spot in the land of Goshen. And they ended up settling in there, and they were given the best acreage to begin farming and agriculturally. But Joseph had it in his head that we're going to go back to the land that God gave Abraham, our father Abraham. And when you go, bring my bones with you. Be sure to bring my bones. And the end of chapter 49, chapter 50, Jacob is giving the blessing on each of the boys. It's really interesting, kind of going through each of those and digging in. But one thing that is important is Joseph keeps in mind, remember to bring me with you when you go to Egypt. So there's kind of the cliffhanger at the end, like they're settled in, they're fruitful, there's abundance. And then you turn the page, you get to Exodus chapter 1, and they're slaves in Egypt. And you're thinking, what happened, this timeline? 400 years, roughly 400 years, they were in the land of Egypt. And by that time, they had become enslaved to the Pharaoh who no longer knew Joseph, it says in Exodus chapter 1. So in this, we have kind of the table being set in summary for all of Genesis. You have the presumption of God's existence. You have the reality of sin entering the world through man's disobedience. And you have the beginning of the line that God's going to bring the Messiah, the solution, as you track Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob into the family of Israel. And each of these segments that God pulls out has some element of hint at the work that Christ will do to accomplish solving the sin problem and setting man right with God again. So God is holy. And it's important to understand, because God is holy, he must judge sin. But at the garden, as Adam and Eve disobeyed and took the fruit and ate of it, the reality of God's holiness is he must judge sin instantly unless he's able to show mercy and ultimately judge sin at another point. And that's what happened in the garden. Rather than Adam and Eve dying instantly, rather than us dying instantly because of our own sin, he's able to show mercy and extend mercy because that sin will be dealt with at some point in the future for Adam and Eve, and it has been dealt with at some point in the past for us. So there is a place where sin is dealt with apart from our ability to deal with it, and that's the cross. So as Adam and Eve were ushered out of the garden and still allowed to live, it was a promise, and essentially it was a foreshadow that there is judgment coming on that sin. But it's possible that someone may actually take the sin judgment in their place. And that's what we've experienced in hindsight. Jesus has taken the judgment in our place, just like he took it in judgment in their place in the future. God extended grace, extended mercy forward until the cross. So he allowed all of those who looked to him in faith in the same concept that we look back in faith to the cross. So it's kind of a bookend type of way to look at how did the cross work, past or future, depending on where you lived in time. And Genesis introduces us to a lot of threads. The nation of Israel, Egypt is a type of the world, Esau is a type of the fleshly man, the serpent is a type of evil, all of these different elements. But the reality is the love of God causes and brings him to decisions and plans that he really just simply is interested in loving us and us loving him, responding to the type of love he shows us. So this is a quick summary of Genesis, not thorough by any stretch. Hopefully it gives you some pegboards to hang it on as you walk through it yourself and you start reading. I hope you enjoy it. And next time we'll probably jump into Exodus. Have a good day.